Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Audrey Lichter, and I'm the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, the sponsor of Scholars Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning, social action, and spiritual and ritual development. Our board chair and president, Scott Shea, has written several books which we have turned into curriculum. In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism, and its companion curriculum, Critical Conversations, is a defense of monotheism and can be used for interfaith dialogue. Conspiracy U, a case study, takes a deep dive into anti-Zionist conspiracy theories on the left and the right. Dr. Pessin has recorded a 5-part video on this book, and there is a companion curriculum which has been used in congregations and college campuses across the country. All of this can be accessed on the Chai Mitzvah website. The Scholars Circle will host lectures from prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community. It is geared to those of us, rabbis, educators, and lay leaders, who are charged with explaining the complex issues facing the Jewish community. To that end, each lecture will have
I believe Audrey has been muted.
You're just muted, nobody can hear you.
Before I introduce Dr. Pessin,
Okay.
a couple of housekeeping rules. To send questions, please use the chat box and message me, Audrey Lichter, anytime throughout the lecture. Q&A will be held at around 7:45, and we will end at 8 p.m. sharp. The lecture recording will be sent to your email shortly and will be available on the Chai Mitzvah website. Now for Dr. Pessin. Dr. Pessin is a graduate of Yale University and holds a PhD from Columbia University. He is a professor of philosophy at Connecticut College and the campus bureau editor of the Allgemeiner. Pessin's scholarly work has gone through many iterations, including contemporary philosophy of the mind, modern philosophy, Descartes, medieval Jewish thinkers, and contemporary Jewish thought. His keen awareness of the hostility to Israel across the college campuses has also led him to do much Zionist research. He also enjoys writing fiction and has authored a number of novels and edited anthologies on anti-Semitism in the United States. Dr. Pessin?
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you to Chai Mitzvah for sponsoring this. It's been such a pleasure working with you in the past, and I do appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to the 50+ participants who've shown up so far, and I know more have registered. It's wonderful to see such interest. Of course, we couldn't have a more timely and upsetting topic, but I'm very glad to see that people are interested. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's turn that into a slideshow, and just give me a thumbs up. You see the screen just before I proceed, Audrey? Yep, great, fantastic. All right, so here we are. I am going to be speaking to you tonight for a while, and we'll have time for questions and answers at the end, as Audrey did mention. The topic is Decoding Hamas, who they are. I'll add the expression, what they want, and why it matters. And maybe the subtitle of this talk could be why they must be defeated for the sake of the free world. You'll notice on the bottom there's my website to find out more about me and my work, or even contact me. You can reach me through my website. And I have just started a Substack writing on issues of concern to Jews in Israel. So it's free. If you're interested, please do check that out. And the address is right down there. Okay. So what are we going to do tonight? We're going to talk about who and what is Hamas, what do they want, why does it matter? We will examine the history and the ideology of Israel's most murderous terrorist group and examine the threat they pose not merely to Israel, but to the entire free world. Grasping this, I think, is essential for understanding why the current conflict is truly existential in nature for Israel and for the Jews, and why we must support Israel, I believe, without limit in its efforts to eradicate this group. Once we understand that, we'll be in a position to make better sense of exactly how Israel is prosecuting the current war. So that's the goal for us. I won't go ahead and play this clip. You can find lots of them online, but this will just, if there's one thing you take away from tonight's talk, it's this message from this clip from Hamas. Basically, the goal is to kill all Jews everywhere in one sentence, right? That's it. And there's lots of these clips floating around the internet now. This is a Hamas official who goes on for quite some length on how important it is to kill not just the Jews in Israel, but to kill them all across the world. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's their goal in a few minutes. So if that's the one thing you take away from this, then you've got the essence of Hamas. So what is Hamas, this group that's so much in the news for the last couple of months? The name is actually an acronym in Arabic for the Islamic Resistance Movement. It also happens to be an Arabic word that means zeal, enthusiasm, or fanaticism, as in fanatics. And in one of those little interesting ironies in Hamas, in Hebrew rather, the word Hamas happens to mean wickedness, violence, or destruction. So exactly. Hamas, in short, is an offshoot of an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. And it was founded in late 1987 by the Palestinian Imam Ahmed Yassin. Right at the start of, coincidental with really the beginning of the first Intifada, as many of you will be aware, late 1987, began an uprising in the Judea Samaria, also known as the West Bank. It was triggered by an automobile accident in which an Israeli army truck crashed into a car at a checkpoint, I think in Gaza, and happened to kill several Palestinian workers. That was the spark that lit the first Intifada. Well, the group organized by Ahmed Yassin met at his house to strategize on how to maximize the impact of this accident in spreading nationalist sentiments and sparking public demonstrations. So I think we could say Hamas had a role in triggering the first Intifada. They didn't reveal the name Hamas until a month or so later. What is Hamas? The most important thing to keep in mind for now is we'll contrast Hamas with the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which many people will be familiar with from its decades of very famous terrorism, its decades of leading the Palestinian nationalist movement. The PLO is largely a secular organization. Hamas comes along and Islamicizes. It turns what was a nationalist campaign ostensibly to establish a Palestinian state on part or all of Israel, the land of Israel. They turn it into a religious mission. It becomes a holy war. They make the whole thing have religious connotations. So that's what they basically offer. They take themselves to be contrasting also with this important point. Their formal establishment came just a month after the PLO had issued a declaration, January 1988, advocating for the coexistence of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Now, there's a lot of questions about how sincere the PLO was in ever accepting what today we call the two-state solution. The crucial thing about the two-state solution, of course, is that it acknowledges the existence of Israel as a Jewish state and calls for the existence of a second state, the Palestinian state, alongside it, ultimately in peaceful coexistence. Was the PLO truly committed to two states? I believe not, but at least they sometimes talk the talk, especially in this period. And the important point here is as they come out officially accepting the two-state solution, which means officially accepting the existence of Israel, well, that's something that Hamas itself cannot possibly accept. Hamas does not accept two states because they will not accept the existence of a Jewish state. They want all of it. And so that contrasts the PLO with Hamas. PLO is secular, Hamas is deeply Islamic or Islamist, maybe more accurately. And the PLO at least officially talk the talk of accepting the Jewish state and a two-state solution. Hamas never does. They published their official charter in August of 1988. And in this charter, we're going to go through some of the clauses of the charter a little bit later, so you'll get a sense of what that's like. In this charter, it defines itself as a chapter of this group called the Muslim Brotherhood, and it declares its desire, it states it quite openly, to establish an Islamic state throughout all of Palestine, right? an Islamic State throughout all of Palestine. Now, there is some talk about the fact that in 2017, just 6 years ago, Hamas did release a new document, which some people call a revised charter, an updated charter. We won't be talking about that document. I think it's some people think Hamas moderated by 2017. I think the events of October 7th prove the falseness of that. They've never moderated, so we will ignore the 2017 document. You should know that it exists. It's still openly states its desire to destroy the state of Israel, but it removes, as we'll see, a lot of the explicitly anti-Semitic elements of the founding charter. So we'll take the founding charter to capture the essence of the group. And again, the desire is to establish an Islamic State throughout all of Palestine, but not just Palestine. And this is why this group is ultimately a threat to the entire free world. I won't play this clip either. You can find many of them online. I do commend to you this organization MEMRI. That's the acronym. It's like Middle East Monitoring and Reporting some institute, I believe. MEMRI collects and translates clips of what is being said in the Arab and Muslim world, which is often very different from what these organizations say when they speak in English to Western audiences. So it's really worth spending time surveying the site MEMRI, and you will be really horrified at many of the things you see there. So here we have a Hamas leader. This clip happens to date back to 2010. It was just the first one I found, but there's plenty more and more recent ones in which they acknowledge that their enterprise extends beyond Palestine. It includes Palestine in its entirety, but also the Arab nation in its entirety, the Islamic nation in its entirety, and the entire world. The goal is to establish an Islamic State, not just in Palestine, but throughout the entire world. Another phrase for this is a global caliphate. A caliphate, there's no separation of church and state in this worldview. So the political leader would also be the religious leader, and that person is called the caliph. And the caliphate would be this sovereign entity which controls the whole globe under the rule of Islam. So that is what Hamas wants. That is their end game, their long-term goal. And this is ultimately why they have to kill all Jews everywhere, because as we will see, they see Jews as the primary obstacle in their plan to establish a global caliphate. Obviously, Jews are an obstacle to establishing an Islamic State in the land of Israel because Jews have the sovereign state of Israel there, but their vision is bigger. They want to establish a global caliphate, and global Jewry is the main obstacle to that. And so global Jewry itself has to be defeated. This is scary and dangerous stuff. And it's not just rhetoric. October 7th, many decades of activities before that have already proven it's not just rhetoric, but October 7th obviously proves it beyond dispute that this is not just rhetoric. A little bit of the history of this group is very important, especially because of the irony that anti-Zionists, people who are hostile to Israel, anti-Israelists, I sometimes call them, love to call Israel all sorts of names, Israel and Israelis, and one of their favorites is, of course, Nazis. Israel is like a Nazi state, Israelis are Nazis, etc. And the crucial and painful irony is that quite literally, Hamas is a continuation of the Nazi program. There's literally a straight line from the Nazis to Hamas. They not only share the same fundamental ideology, except the Islam part, and a key source text, as we'll see, but they essentially even work together. So let's spend a few minutes taking a look at that. As we mentioned, Hamas is the Palestine or Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is how they identify themselves in their charter. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the Muslim Brotherhood? The Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist renewal movement that was founded in Egypt back in 1928 by a man named Hassan al-Banna. Try to remember that name. He'll pop back up again in a little while. Hassan al-Banna. And its goal is to establish the global caliphate that we were just talking about. And this organization has, over the years, established many offshoots in many different regions, many of which are militant, or another word for that would be terrorist in nature. It's actually banned and illegal in a number of Arab states. Many of the Arab governments see the Muslim Brotherhood as a genuine threat to them, and it is. Its commitment to Islamic terrorism basically ensures that. It was founded in opposition to the dominance of the West in the early part of the 20th century, the dominance of the West over the Middle East. They believe that in order to reassert Islamic supremacy, they need to get people to return to fundamentalist Islam, become religious fanatics, to use the word Hamas right there, and pursue, and this will be an important word for us, pursue jihad against non-Muslims. Jihad is, of course, a word that has many meanings. The most important meaning for us in this context is jihad is holy war, violence against non-Muslims in order to establish Islam and this global caliphate. So this idea in Hamas comes right out of its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood. Its official slogan is Islam is the solution. And you might ask, to what problem or to what question? And the answer is to every problem and to every question. So Islam informs every single thing they do. They are a fundamentalist Islamic movement. Again, synthesizing religion and politics. No enlightenment has come to this region. The Enlightenment in Western Europe is what separated church and state, which was a very important thing to establish individual freedoms. That's not what this movement is about. It is a totalitarian movement. It is meant to organize and control every aspect of every individual's life. And again, synthesizing the religion and politics by establishing an Islamic state governed by Sharia. It's not religion as a private matter, which is this Western Enlightenment notion. It's religion as the organizing principle of all aspects of life. So they are pretty serious. The key figure for our purposes tonight is one that I'm sure some in this audience will have heard of, as a person you will have heard of, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who lived from 1897 to 1974, known by his title, which I think it was the British who originally gave him this title in the British Mandate, the Mufti, which meant he was basically the religious leader of Islam in Palestine in the first part of the 20th century. So he is a key figure for anyone who wants to understand the Israeli-Palestinian, Jewish, Arab, Muslim conflict, as I like to call it, and certainly in understanding Hamas. So there's a picture. In this famous photo, he's a very gentle, nice-looking guy, which belies his true nature, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others. He led the Palestinian Arabs from the early 1920s until at least the early 1950s, although he may still have been operating behind the scenes up until closer to his death in 1974. He held the title of Mufti, or Islamic leader in Palestine, for many, many years. He was officially the representative of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. Remember, it had been founded in Egypt. He worked closely with its leader and his friend, Hassan al-Banna. That was the name I mentioned before. Continue to remember that name. He'll pop back in at least one more time. So he worked directly with his friend, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, including in the work of recruiting militants to pursue jihad. He was personally behind much of the violence against Jews in Palestine in the 1920s and 1930s. He was very much involved in the famous 1929 pogrom that was inspired by his claim that the Jews were threatening Al-Aqsa. If that sounds familiar, what was the name of Hamas's most recent operation, October 7th? It was the Al-Aqsa flood. They are protecting Al-Aqsa from the defilement of the Jews. So exactly the same playbook. The Mufti was behind that in 1929. Hamas is doing that in the year 2023. He was also very involved in the Arab revolts in Palestine, 1936 through 1939. I'll assume some of you are familiar with that basic history. My point is, he's the key figure. He's behind a lot of this. He escaped British prosecution. By the 1930s, the British were after him because he was a troublemaker causing all this violence. He escaped prosecution by fleeing first to Iraq, where he was responsible for the Farhud, the pogrom against Iraqi Jews in 1941, and then moved on to, literally, Nazi Germany. And he spent the war years, World War II, who he spent in Berlin, where he met and collaborated with Hitler. He worked with German intelligence. He had his own operational budget. He had like a budget line from the Nazis and working with German intelligence, and he helped establish a Muslim division of the SS in Yugoslavia. So he literally recruited Muslim soldiers to fight for the Nazi cause. This is the Muslim Brotherhood representative in Palestine doing this. And here are some very famous pictures, and these should be burned into your brain. He might have, in that portrait, he might have looked like a nice, gentle guy, but here he is on the left, meeting with Hitler. Very famous moment, very famous photograph. On the right, there he is with Himmler, head of the SS. And on the bottom right, there he is inspecting some of the troops in the regiment that he had assembled for the Nazis and giving them, of course, the Nazi salute. So that's the Mufti. What else did he do? While he was working with Hitler in Berlin, he convinced the Germans that the Arabs would be natural allies of Germany in the struggle against the British, the Bolsheviks, the communists, and the Jews. And he spent the war years literally broadcasting Nazi propaganda throughout the Arabic-speaking world. He brought the Arabs into the Nazi program. There are some scholars who suggest, that it was the Mufti who convinced Hitler to adopt the final solution. As far as I understand, I'm not a scholar of this. There's no consensus on this, but that idea is out there, that he literally convinced Hitler to move from expelling the Jews from the Nazi realm to murdering them, exterminating them. And the plan was very much to help Hitler win the European war and bring the final solution to the Middle East. That was the explicit program. He would exterminate the Jews of Europe, and then with victory in the Middle East, exterminate the Jews in Palestine. After the war, he was sought as a war criminal by the Allies, but French political maneuverings allowed him to go to Egypt, where he received political asylum. There he became leader of the Arab Higher Committee on Palestine, where he was responsible for rejecting the UN partition plan, supported the Arab war against Israel in 1948, and set about Islamicizing the national movement. So putting this all together, the Muslim Brotherhood produces the Mufti, who literally is a Nazi and worked with the Nazis and who promotes Islamization. And Hamas is founded literally to perpetuate that very same movement and ideology. Hamas literally is the Islamicized Nazi movement. Hamas is the 21st century Nazi movement, which makes it just all the more bitter and ironic when anti-Zionists call Israel Nazis or Israelis Nazis, when Hamas literally is the Nazi movement. So what are Hamas's aims? Well, happily they tell us. It's no secret. The goals of Hamas are laid out in this document, which is known as the Hamas Charter of August 1988. And as I mentioned, there's no evidence that they've ever renounced or retreated from even a single line of this document, even when they did produce a new document in 2017. The most fundamental goal, as we've mentioned before, is to implement Islam fully and strictly and universally, meaning everywhere, ultimately for all people. All people should become Muslims is the goal. Charter states about Hamas that, and this is from Article 8 of the Charter, Allah is its target, the Prophet is its example, and the Quran, which is the scripture, the holy book, is its constitution. Jihad is its path, and death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. Right? Keep that in mind. Hamas was very famous in the 90s and 2000s for the suicide bombing campaigns, which in fact, strictly speaking, suicide is forbidden by Islam, and they had to get sort of special fatwas or permission to commit suicide in the act of jihad to make it permissible. And this is a death cult. Their loftiest wish is death for the sake of Allah. That will make them a very hard enemy. Most other enemies that you fight, they want to live, and so you can ultimately negotiate with them, but they consider dying for the sake of the war the loftiest thing possible. You get basically religious paradise as a result of it. So never forget that when people are talking about Hamas. The most relevant there's 36 articles in the charter, and the most relevant reflect 4 main themes, and then we'll go through a few of the specifics. So one theme is the complete destruction of Israel as an essential condition for the liberation of Palestine and for the establishment of a theocratic state based on Islamic law. Remember, they started in opposition to the PLO after the PLO said, okay, we're okay with 2 states. They might not have meant it, but at least they said it. To say you're okay with 2 states is to acknowledge you accept the existence of the Jewish state. Well, they make it quite clear they do not accept the existence of a Jewish state. And how could they if their goal is to establish an Islamic state throughout all of Palestine? Theme 2. The need for unrestrained and unceasing holy war or jihad to obtain or attain that objective. The mission to destroy Israel is conceived of as a sacred calling. To be a good Muslim, to be a proper Muslim, you must pursue this mission. It says, you know, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you have to keep kosher. It's part of what it is to be an Orthodox Jew. To be a proper Muslim, at least according to Hamas, you must seek unrestrained and unceasing holy war against the Jews, right? So it becomes a religious imperative. The charter is full of quotes from the Quran referring to warfare against disbelievers in Islam. So they base this in the Quran itself. But let's also remember destroying Israel is just one step of the larger goal. It's to establish this Islamic caliphate throughout the entire globe. Israel is the first step and probably the most important step for them, but they do have bigger motives as well. And again, the idea is this is an Islamic religious imperative for them. As a result of this, and we'll see where we go through this in the charter in a moment, the absolute rejection of any negotiated resolution or political settlement of Jewish versus Muslim claims in the Holy Land. They will openly state this. We do not accept any negotiations, any political settlement. This is another way of saying there's no compromise available here. It's, you know, from the perspective of Orthodox Judaism and halacha, for example, you're not supposed to mix meat and dairy. You don't make a compromise and say, okay, well, I'll just do it on Thursdays or something like that. When something is a religious law, there are no compromises available to it. So in Hamas's worldview, destroying Israel and removing the Jewish state, and that will require removing the Jews themselves, is a religious imperative. There's no compromise. And if there's nothing to compromise, what's the point of having a negotiation or discussion at any point about it? And so they're very open about this. No negotiated resolution. For this reason, they are very opposed to the PLO, especially as we got to the Oslo agreements in the early 1990s when those negotiations were happening. They thought the PLO was selling out by negotiating with the Jews, and to negotiate with someone, you have to recognize they have some rights, and and they have some rights as well, and you have to concede to them. That's not their view. So they are actually quite bitter enemies of the PLO, who they saw as selling out on their religious obligations. And those of you who know the history of this region know that the PLO and Hamas do not like each other. All right, theme number 4. The reinforcement or the use of historical anti-Semitic tropes and calumnies and sinister conspiracy theories. As we will see, this charter is just dripping with classical, today it's usually called right-wing anti-Semitism, but of course this, as a continuation of the Nazi movement, we could call them a right-wing fascist organization. But we'll see that we'll talk a little bit about leftist progressives who adopt a lot of the same tropes. But we'll go through this document and we will see their use of just straightforward classic anti-Semitism. So those are the main themes. With that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at the charter itself. And so you can see the words. You can find the charter. It's been available in an English translation for many years. I put the website up there on top. If you just Google Hamas Charter in English or just Hamas Charter, this will come up right away. And so you can read it yourself. And I think every person should spend a little time and read through this charter. You need to know who you're dealing with. We need to know who we're dealing with here. And they make no secret of it. The fact that they make no secret of it makes it that much more bitter and ironic and painful what we're seeing on campus today, and we might talk about this a little bit later. the whole Western progressive movement basically sides with Hamas, and Hamas could not be more antithetical to everything that Western progressivism actually stands for. It's as if they pretend that Hamas is something other than it is, but Hamas never pretends it's something other than it is, and we will see that now as we start looking at the charter itself. So the preamble, the beginning of the charter, basically starts this way. It quotes, this is a quote, that Israel will exist and continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. And who is the quote from? The martyr Imam Hassan al-Banna of blessed memory, namely the man who founded the Muslim Brotherhood. So Hamas is continuing the Muslim Brotherhood program, and point number one of the Muslim Brotherhood program is the goal is to obliterate the state of Israel. And just in case you're wondering, there's no way of obliterating the state of Israel that won't involve massacring many, many Jews. They saw themselves as fulfilling their program on October 7th. Continuing on in the preamble. This covenant of the Islamic resistance movement, remember the acronym is Hamas, clarifies its picture, reveals its identity, outlines its stand, explains its aims, speaks about its hope, etc. Our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. Not against Israelis, not against Zionists. It's our struggle against the Jews. It needs all sincere efforts. The movement is but one squadron that should be supported by more until the enemy is vanquished. The Jews are the enemy, and the Jews must be vanquished, and Allah's victory is realized. So the war is with the Jews. It's not with Israel. It's not with the Zionists. It is with the Jews, and they will quote many passages from the Quran to support everything they say throughout this document. Article 1, the movement's program is Islam. Islam is the solution. Remember that slogan from the Muslim Brotherhood, right? From Islam, it draws its ideas, its ways of thinking, its understanding of the universe, etc., etc. This is an Islamist organization. The Islamic resistance movement is one of the wings of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. So opening that, and here it strives to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. For under the wing of Islam, followers of all religions can coexist in security and safety where their lives, possessions, and rights are concerned. In the absence of Islam, strife will be rife. Oppression spreads, evil prevails, and schisms and wars will break out. A lot we could say about this particular clause, but the goal is the world should submit to Islam. And once you at least admit the dominance of Islam, they will allow certain other religions to have a sort of second-class status. They can exist in security and safety, but only when they submit to Islam as the overlords. So this is quite literally an Islamic supremacy movement. I don't know what that red mark is there. Sorry about that. Article 7. We talk about white supremacy sometimes. This is Islamic supremacy, quite literally. Article 7. The Islamic resistance movement aspires to the realization of Allah's promise, no matter how long that should take. The Prophet, meaning Muhammad, the founder of Islam, has said, and now here's a quote, and this is a very famous quote. And let's read the quote and then we'll talk about it. So this is quoting Muhammad, the founder of Islam, who has said, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, oh, Muslims, oh, Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Only the Garkad tree, evidently a certain kind of tree, would not do that because it's one of the trees of the Jews who got this sort of conspiratorial thinking here. So what is this saying here? Hamas aims to realize God's promise. And what is God's promise? Well, Muhammad explains what God's promise is, that the day of judgment won't come until Muslims kill the Jews, all the Jews, wherever the Jews might be. And that day will be so special that even when the Jews try to hide behind stones and trees, the trees will come say, there's a Jew behind me, come kill him. So it doesn't get clearer than that. This is not actually from the Quran. This is from something called the Hadith, which are the sayings and stories of Muhammad, which are have just about the same sacred status as the Quran. So this is Hamas in a nutshell right there. The goal is to kill all the Jews. The Jews are the main obstacle to the global caliphate, and the day of judgment will not come until Muslims kill all the Jews. If this is your religious belief, again, this is not negotiable. There's no compromise available here. In their view, God told them this through their prophet, Muhammad. God told them, kill all the Jews. So what are you going to compromise? There's nothing to compromise. This should never be forgotten. This is what we're dealing with here. And just in case you think this is, they only say it and they don't mean it. Well, they say it repeatedly and repeatedly. This is just another clip going around the internet. But again, if you go to sites like Memory, you'll find dozens and dozens of these. Here's a Hamas leader saying in 2019, we mustn't just kill the Jews in Israel, we need to kill them across the entire world. I won't play the clip. Article 8. Allah is its target, the Prophet is its model, the Quran is its constitution, jihad is its path, and death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. We read that. So they long to die in the act of jihad. Article 11, this one gets slightly technical, and we'll start winding down just a minute. The Islamic resistance movement believes that the land of Palestine is an Islamic waqf consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day. The concept of a waqf is, the idea in short is that once Islam has conquered a region, it becomes consecrated or sacred to Islam only, and it should belong to Islam until the end of time. That's the idea. And so we all know that for at least 400 years, the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire, had conquered and colonized and occupied Palestine. It was a Muslim land. And so in this worldview of Hamas, it must always be a Muslim land. It can never belong to anybody else. Once conquered, it has to stay Muslim forever. And given this fact, I think I put it here. No, that's not quite it. But given this fact, again, there's no room for compromise. They say in the next sentence, actually, that was in that first bit there, no one can promise this or negotiate this away. God has determined that this land must belong to the Muslims, right? And so who is the PLO to say, okay, the Jews can have some of it, which the PLO was saying, even if they didn't mean it? Again, non-negotiable, no room for compromise whatsoever. And the same goes for any land that Islam has conquered. And that includes, for example, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. You might know, like through the medieval period, Islam conquered a good chunk of that. So they believe they're coming for that too. First Israel, but then they're going to come for Europe. And then, of course, obviously, the world. This is powerful stuff. Nothing in nationalism is more significant or deeper than the case when an enemy should tread Muslim land. Resisting and quelling the enemy is the individual duty of every Muslim. So they believe every Muslim everywhere has the religious obligation to remove enemies from their land. By the way, what all of this also suggests is that they don't actually care about a Palestinian state. They're not actually a national liberation movement in the way that the PLO advertised itself. Their goal is to have this be Muslim land. It doesn't have to be a Palestinian state. And if Egypt conquered the whole thing, or the Ottomans came back and reconquered it, that's fine for Hamas. It has to be Muslim. It has to be Islamic. It doesn't have to be Palestinian. And so they're not really a Palestinian liberation organization or a Palestinian movement. They are an Islamist organization. Here they state explicitly, initiatives, peaceful solutions, conferences are in contradiction to the principles. There is no negotiation possible. There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad, armed violence, terrorism. Everything else is a waste of time. And again, liberation of Palestine is an individual duty for every Muslim, wherever he may be. It's not a surprise that in the weeks after October 7th, Hamas leaders several times put out calls to all Muslims everywhere in the world to bring the jihad against all Jews everywhere in the world, because that's part of their program. All right, so this is a long passage here. If you want to skim it, you can skim it. But what we're starting to see here now, is the anti-Semitism that I talked about. they're talking about the enemies. The enemies are the Jews. And look what they say about the Jews. The Jews strive to amass great wealth, which they devote to the realization of their dream. What is their dream? To take over the world. With their money, they took control of the world media, news agencies, the press, publishing houses, broadcasting stations, and others. Jews control everything. With their money, Jews stirred revolutions in various parts of the world. The Jews were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution. They formed secret societies such as Freemasons, Rotary clubs, the Lions, etc. So we see this idea, the conspiratorial idea, that the Jews have a program to take over the world. All of this, for those familiar with this, is spelled out in detail in the famous anti-Semitic forgery, the book called The Protocols for the Elders of Zion. It was appeared in the very early 1900s. It purported to be the secret minutes of the Elders of Zion, the Jews who ultimately controlled the world, and it purported out their strategy. Am I muted?
No.
Okay, I got a thing that I was muted. Lay out the strategy that the Jews were allegedly planning to take over the world. The book was absolute forgery. It is the most important anti-Semitic text ever published. It is the most influential anti-Semitic text ever published. Hitler and the Nazis studied this text. That's why the Jews were their enemies. But what we're seeing here now is that Hamas is literally taking material right out of the same text that the Nazis used to justify the final solution. And this is, of course, just classic anti-Semitism, that the Jews are controlling the world for their own benefit. A little bit later in the document, they explicitly name the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So anyone familiar with the text will recognize it in this passage here. And here's just a little bit more of the same. Quoting the Quran. So often as they shall kindle a fire for war, and they is the Jews. So the Quran dates back to the 7th century of the Common Era. It talks about how evil the Jews are, and here Hamas quotes the Quran to reaffirm that the Jews of the 21st century, the same Jews, are evil. So they'll kindle a fire for war, and we shall extinguish it. They will set their minds to act corruptly in the earth, but God does not love corrupt evildoers, right? So this is their Islamic anti-Semitism, which is indistinguishable from Nazi anti-Semitism, ultimately, and more of the same. The Zionist invasion is a vicious invasion. So it talks about, again, how evil the Zionists are, and they see Israel and Zionism as the tools or mechanism by which Jews aim to control the world. So before Israel existed, Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the Nazis, Jews had this secret cabal to take over the world. But once they established Israel, Israel now is the mechanism by which they will aim to obtain complete global domination. So Israel becomes sort of the Jew writ large. Anti-Zionism, the hatred of Israel, just is immediate transference from the hatred of Jews that produces it. And here blaming Zionists for undermining societies, destroying values, corrupting consciences, right? This is just straightforward Jew hatred dressed up as Israel hatred. And then they say explicitly, Israel, Judaism, and the Jews challenge Islam and the Muslim people. May the cowards never sleep. Another quote from the Quran saying, we're coming after you, right? You have to stay awake because we are coming after you. Okay, here's just another statement of Islamic supremacism. Under Islam, the other religions can coexist peacefully as long as Islam is on top and they are subservient to it. It's the duty of other religions to stop disputing the sovereignty of Islam in this region. So Christians and Jews have an obligation to capitulate to Islam in this region. World Zionism. We come to the end in just a minute. This is world Zionism, together with imperialistic powers, try through a plan and strategy to remove one Arab state after another from the circle of struggle against Zionism, right? What they're referring to here is, of course, that Israel made a peace treaty with Egypt and made a peace treaty. This was 1988, so that was the only one that existed there, and was working on other peace treaties with the other Arab nations. Hamas absolutely stands opposed to all these peace treaties. reading this article and thinking about the timing of October 7th, as many people have noted, Israel was in negotiations with Saudi Arabia to expand the Abraham agreements, the Abraham Accords, which were bringing more Arab countries into the fold. From Article 32, we see Hamas cannot let this stand. We oppose any peace treaties with any Arab countries. And so they go to war on October 7th. One of the motivations for that war was to halt these processes. So we see that clearly in Article 32. And here, I just note the Zionist plan is embodied in the Protocol of the Elders of Man. So they openly quote this famous anti-Semitic forgery. By the way, it was proven to be a forgery within a few years after appearing in the early 1900s, but that hasn't stopped this book from spreading around the world. It's actually sold very widely in the Arab world. The Soviet Union made translations of Protocols of Elders of Zion into Arabic and distributed it throughout the Arab and Muslim world in the 1960s and 1970s. And so they're quoting it as if it's a factual document, when of course it's just an anti-Semitic forgery. So, conclusions. Now we understand this movement. It's not actually a national liberation movement, but a global Islamist movement aiming to establish a global caliphate by means of global jihad. It believes it must exterminate all the Jews in the world as part of this plan. It rejects negotiation and compromise. In which case, if Israel is to defend itself from this genocidal program, it can only be by the elimination of Hamas. Put these pieces together. Hamas aims for extermination and genocide, no negotiation, no compromise. It's a religious duty. If Israel's ever to protect itself from this, it can only be by the elimination of Hamas. And in fact, each of the previous wars, Hamas started 4 previous wars, ended the same way. The world tends to stop Israel from fighting. The wars ended in a stalemate, and each time Hamas comes back stronger. I don't know where which means we can't have a stalemate here, because next time Hamas is going to come back, they're going to have biological weapons or chemical weapons or maybe a nuclear weapon, given Iran. So given all of those conclusions, it seems the ultimate conclusion is clear. Israel must fight without limits to eliminate this genocidal terrorist organization, to stop it from destroying Israel and the Jews, but also to stop it from its plan of implementing a global caliphate. The whole free world depends on it. So I will stop there. Thank you very much. And hopefully there will be some questions.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Okay, there are a number of questions about trying to understand how widespread is the Hamas theology in terms of the Arab world in general? And can you explain the difference between Islam and Hamas? And where are the moderates? Are there moderates? Seems that Hamas has a lot of popularity. So where are the moderates, and what prognosis is there for any kind of two-state solution at this point?
Those are 3 enormous questions all at once. So I'm certainly not an expert on Islam and global Islam, but so what I can tell you is, Islam has many different streams, sects, and denominations. They do not all always get along. There's much disagreement within Islam, just as there's disagreement, amongst Jews and Jewish sects and denominations. So it is not the case that Hamas's theology is universal and that all Muslims share it. Absolutely not. In fact, there are many Muslims who think that Hamas are crazy fanatics and don't represent them. So those absolutely do exist. And in fact, even that notion of the waqf, that technical notion that we briefly talked about, when Hamas claimed that Palestine belongs to Islam because it was once conquered by Islam, that actually was a minority opinion amongst scholars of Islam, like Islamic scholars. They thought that was idiosyncratic and they didn't agree with it. So Islam, but I can't give numbers. I can't say what percent. What you also have, even separate from the theology, there's tremendous hatred of Jews in Israel across the Arab and Muslim world, for sure. So even those Muslims that might not share Hamas's particular stream of Islam hate Israel and see Hamas as taking heroic actions to overthrow Israel. So they're cheering on, so many are cheering on Hamas, not because they agree with its theology, but because they agree with the destruction of Israel for their own separate reasons. And so they do have absolutely widespread support throughout the Islamic world, even if not necessarily in terms of Islam. As far as the prognosis for a two-state solution, there's any number of talking heads which will give you any number of opinions. I don't see how it's possible, personally, in the foreseeable future. Amongst the things that died on October 7th was any prospect for Israel to withdraw from territory and give a state to the Palestinians in this generation or the next one. Who knows what happens 50 years from now, 75 from 100 years from now. But what the whole Gaza experiment was about was when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in 2005. They uprooted 8,000 people. They removed all their soldiers. They gave it over to the Palestinians. And part of the idea was an experiment. If the Palestinians could establish a peaceful enclave there, and the word of the time was it could be another Singapore. It's actually prime real estate. It's right on the Mediterranean. The international community pumps billions of dollars into Gaza. They could have developed this wonderful, beautiful, peaceful place. Had that happened, then some years later, the idea of maybe Israel withdrawing from the West Bank and allowing that to become a Palestinian state becomes much more plausible, right? No, most Israelis would be very happy with a two-state solution on the assumption that Palestinians accepted the two states and wanted to live in peace side by side. And that was the experiment that Gaza was about. But what happened? The Palestinian Authority was almost immediate. First of all, the Hamas won a parliamentary election, and then in a violent coup overthrew the Palestinian Authority and took over Gaza. And we see what they did. They spent billions of dollars building military infrastructure and tunnels and began launching rockets and have started 16 years of nonstop warfare and terrorism. And so what that shows is when Israel leaves a place and leaves a vacuum behind, at least in the current generation, terrorism takes root and thrives. Same thing happened in Lebanon, which they had, no claim to, but when they withdrew from Lebanon in 2000, was or 2002, early 2000s, it was immediately taken over by Hezbollah, which now has 100,000 rockets aimed at Israel right on the border, right? And so the idea that Israel after October 7th could even entertain withdrawing from the West Bank and giving it to the Palestinians, that's just not entertainable. I can't imagine by even the most peacenik left-wing Israelis. I think their dream was shattered on October 7th. So I think for the next generation, there's no possibility of a two-state solution. But of course, the famous thing about anyone who pontificates on the Israeli-Palestinian Jewish Arab-Muslim conflict is everybody's wrong all the time about everything. So who knows what tomorrow will bring, but it's hard to foresee that.
So turning to, there's so many questions just about Hamas and Qatar and the negotiations and the extent of Hamas outside of the Palestinian territory, and if it's possible to actually eradicate Hamas at all. But I want to turn just in the few minutes we have to the college campus. There's a question that says, would you say that the use of terms like colonizers or apartheid is for the benefit of the progressive left to get them to buy in rather than to get them to buy in as part of the Hamas program? So could you talk a little bit about
that's easy. Yes.
the college campus?
Yes. So, for those like myself who've been watching the campus scene for a number of years now, I also work for the Allgemeiner. I think Audrey mentioned at the very beginning, a wonderful news outlet that focuses on matters concerned to Jews in Israel. And I'm the campus bureau editor. So in that capacity, I'm just keeping my eye on the campus scene. I've been doing that since 2016, I believe. The trajectory has been clear. The hostility and hatred of not just of Israel, but even towards Jews has just been growing over these last 7 years. But even so, when October 7th happened, it didn't surprise me how campuses reacted. It was still shocking to see, which is, to this point, I was very comfortable saying I'd reached the conclusion, wow, they really hate Israel and Jews on a lot of campuses in North America and in Europe. And after October 7th, that changed to, wow, they really want Jews to be dead on a lot of these campuses. And this is stunning. Campuses are not places where you're supposed to cheer for, support violence, want people to be dead. Campuses are supposed to be bastions of reason, amongst other things. And instead, what we saw was on many campuses, major campuses, Ivy Leagues, and I'm sure many of you are following, the Harvard debacle, but Harvard, Yale, Princeton, University of Michigan, University of Chicago, you name it, Berkeley, all of the major campuses, even while the massacre was still ongoing on that Saturday and on that Sunday, before Israel had dropped a single bomb in Gaza, open rallies celebrating and supporting this massacre. And I am still traumatized by that as much as I'm traumatized by October 7th as well. I have a lot of healing I have to figure out how to do in the months ahead. Now, how is that possible that you have people on campuses, on Ivy League campuses, University of Chicago, campuses, elite campuses like that, openly supporting the slaughter? Now, there's a lot that could be said. I've been writing about that. So subscribe to my Substack and you'll see some of the pieces I've been writing. So I'm just trying to make sense of this. So the short answer is, as the questioner put it, the academy, which is absolutely dominated by very extreme left progressive ideology, overwhelmingly, is against things like colonization and apartheid and against racism. And we should all be against those things. Those are bad things, right? But that left progressive movement synthesizes with what's really been this 20-year BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement, which is run primarily by this organization called Students for Justice in Palestine, which now has over 200 chapters on different campuses in North America. So for 20 years, SJP has been running this BDS campaign, which endlessly spews lies about Israel. And those lies are the things that charge Israel with genocide, ethnic cleansing, colonization, apartheid, et cetera, et cetera. So when you fuse those together, the liberal progressive hostility towards those evil things, and then the idea or claim that Israel is guilty of those evil things, then you get what we see on campuses, that we can celebrate this because it's an act of decolonization. And indeed, many people explicitly use that language. This was decolonization. This is liberation. The oppressed Palestinians are being liberated by it. Now, of course, there's 1,000 things that are wrong with that reasoning, but that's one thing that helps at least make sense of how it's possible that people on campuses who, by the way, think of themselves as extremely moral people. These are the people who are for diversity, inclusion, tolerance, anti-racism, right? These are moral ideals. These are the people who are cheering the slaughter of families and children, right? So the only way to make sense of that is to say, in their mind, they're overlooking the violence itself somehow and just categorizing it as decolonization and liberation, and therefore they can approve of it. But that is, again, wrong on so many levels. And it shows that there's something really deeply wrong with higher education today, which we're all seeing. I think it came to just a beautiful, the epitome of that was the congressional testimony with the college presidents unable to acknowledge that calling for the genocide of Jews might violate a campus code or not. That captured it in that one sentence. And I think a lot of people now are seeing there's really something wrong with higher education that we got to this point. So if there's a silver lining, I shouldn't even say that, October 7th is nothing but darkness. But if one good thing can perhaps come from it, it might be an earthquake in higher education that's been building for the last couple of decades at least. It might be time for really reshaping and restructuring of higher education, which I think would be a good thing.
Okay, so much more to talk about. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. So people can learn more about your writing, going to your Substack and contacting Dr. Pessin
through my website. Right,
website.
exactly. And I'm happy to hear from people, so please feel free to reach out.
Okay, so I want to remind you that this lecture will be recorded and be available on our website, chaimitzvah.org, shortly. Please stay tuned for our next lecture with Dr. Ola Kirschman-Shirazi on the Abrahamic Accords. Thank you for participating tonight, and good night, and see you in 2 weeks on Thursday, January 4th at noon. Dr. Kirschbaum actually lives in Israel, so her program will have to be in the middle of the afternoon. So see you on January 4th at noon. Thank you again, Dr. Pessin,
And thanks everybody for attending. Really appreciate that.
good night.